Well, folks, as of today, it has been a decade since I started reviewing video games on YouTube, and it's been quite a ride thus far. I've reviewed over 500 games and expansion packs, and of course done quite a lot of MTOs on various betas, demos, and even full games. And as I've been doing these videos, I've gotten much more comfortable recording and editing, and I've actually managed to improve the reviews and MTOs and all that dramatically over the years, although there's always room for improvement, which is why I was a bit worried about doing this particular review, because the decade anniversary of reviewing needs to be a very special review. It needs to be something that's either very personal to me or very personal to the channel. And while I do have plans for the Elder Scrolls series throughout the rest of the month, this particular game is not the Elder Scrolls. This is something that's actually very personal to me. It's very near and dear to my heart. And that's partly why I'm worried about it, because I'm worried I can't do this game justice. But I'll certainly do my best. So, without further ado, let me introduce you to the review special for a decade of reviewing video games on YouTube. I hope you enjoy it. Sorry to disappoint those of you who actually believed my April Fool's joke this year, but I'm not reviewing StarCraft. This is my review of Arcanum, of Steamworks and Magick Obscura, developed by Troika Games and published by Sierra in 2001 for PC. It was actually the debut title for Troika, and was generally very well received apart from a lot of technical problems that the game had, and it went on to be Troika's best-selling game, having sold over 230,000 copies. Which may not seem like a lot, but back in 2001, that was actually a fair bit. It just wasn't really enough to keep the studio alive for all that long, because unfortunately Troika did close in 2005 after having developed only 3 games. This, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, and Greyhawk the Temple of Elemental Evil. They were working on a sequel to Arcanum when the studio had to close, but unfortunately it's looking like we're never actually going to see a sequel, which is a crying shame as far as I'm concerned. But the developers did go on to set up in other studios later on, with 2 of the 3 main designers, Leonard Boyarsky and Tim Kaine, both now working at Obsidian and working on their current projects. But more important than where are they now and sales figures is, how is this game really? What are we actually dealing with when you go into Arcanum and you actually try to play it? Well, let's go ahead and start delving right into it and find out. And we'll start like we always do with the presentation, which in its day was really not impressive, and it really hasn't aged all that well either. You've probably noticed by now that the interface looks very odd with regards to the footage, and that's because I am using the widescreen mod for this particular game, and I'm running it in 720p. I couldn't get it to run in 1080p, but the default resolution is 800 by 600, which even for 2001 was actually very low. And let me tell you, if you try to run it at that resolution on a 1080p monitor, it just looks terrible. Now, even back in the day, it really didn't look all that great. In fact, that was one of the major criticisms people had about it when it was originally released. They thought that the graphics were too low res, they thought that they were very outdated by current standards at the time, which were mostly 3D graphics by that point. Now, that's not to say the game is ugly or anything, it's just that it looks like the earlier Fallout games, Fallout 1 and 2 specifically, and that's kind of a problem because those games came out in 1997 and 98 respectively. So what you ultimately have here is a 2D isometric role-playing game, and that can get kind of annoying when you're dealing with various issues like there's no rotation on the camera, so you can't change your viewpoint to get a better view of what you're doing or get a better view of the constraints of the level. And you do occasionally have some issues with perspective, namely things like if something is behind a wall, sometimes it's kind of difficult to click on it, even though it is clearly there, it's just that you can't get just the right pixel. And sometimes when you're trying to activate something, you need to be pixel perfect with your actual clicks, and those don't always work. A lot of people also complain about the interface. Now, I'm just a bit biased here because I've gotten used to the interface, but it's really not that unintuitive once you understand where everything is and how it actually functions. It's just that initial learning curve when you're actually looking for where things are and you're trying to figure out exactly how the interface works can be a bit confusing. But once you get past all of that, you find that the art style, again, is very reminiscent of the older Fallout games in terms of how characters look and such like that. but you're dealing with a steampunk environment that also has a lot of fantasy elements thrown in. So for example, if you're running around in the city of Tarant, it's going to look like an Industrial Revolution era city, complete with steam rail and actually some trains and everything like that, whereas if you're running around in the Elven Forest, it's going to look very fantastical. Now sadly, there's not a lot of character customization in terms of how you look. Whenever you equip a new suit of armor, it makes your sprite look different, but other than that, the only way you can change how you look is to alter your portrait when you create your character at the beginning of the game. And unfortunately, a lot of the equipment is just palette swapped in terms of what you actually see on your sprite. So for example, if you're wearing Mystic Plate Mail versus Basic Plate Mail, the Basic Plate Mail might just look like a suit of plate armor, whereas the Mystic Plate Mail might have some blue or purple accents. This means that there's really not a huge amount of variety with the way the various NPCs look, unless of course they are a specific major NPC, in which case they may look very different. So that'll probably be very disappointing for people who are really into the character customization aspect of just making your character look as badass as possible, because you can't really do that in Arcanum. Not to mention the game does still have a few graphics glitches, like some sprite corruption here and there, although that usually sorts itself out within a few seconds, so it's never really that big of a problem. And occasionally you'll notice on the environment something will just look a bit off because it's either floating a bit, or it just doesn't line up with the terrain exactly, and thus you'll end up with some pretty hard edges sometimes. And that was something that has always been a problem for the game, so ultimately, in its day, the visuals were somewhat disappointing, and it really hasn't improved much since its release, even with the patches. Then, of course, you move over into sound design, and that's where things get wildly different. Certain NPCs are fully voiced. Now, they couldn't voice every single NPC in the game because there is an awful lot of dialogue in this thing, but major NPCs do get voices, and generally speaking, they're actually played rather well. But even with the voice acting, you do still have to pay attention to the text of the dialogue because that'll give you various cues as to how they're actually behaving. So for example, it'll put in brackets that they wink at you or that they shuffle around nervously or something like that. So even if the character is voiced, you're still reading text. Now for all you whippersnappers out there who only grew up with fully voiced video games, understand this. Back in 2001, that was starting to become more of a thing. But before that, role-playing games really didn't have much voice acting in them. In fact, by the time you hit 2001, they still didn't have much voice acting because the costs would just be too high, both in space and, of course, in money. So that's not really a problem for Arcanum when you consider when it was released. It's only a problem in hindsight when you're just lazy and don't want to read any text. Although it does have the amusement factor of whenever you discover a voiced NPC, you instantly associate in your brain, oh, well, they're important, so I better pay attention. But anyway, point is that for its era, Arcanum has some fairly standard distribution of voice acting, and it is fairly solid voice acting, so that actually lends a fair bit to the game. The same can't really be said for the sound effects, which are functional, and they certainly get the job done decently enough, but they're not remotely impressive. For example, explosions and gun sounds are actually fairly wimpy, so you don't really feel like you're firing particularly powerful weapons most of the time, but spells sound decently powerful at least, so there is that. But then there's the standout feature of the sound design, which is the soundtrack by Ben Hug. Unlike the majority of soundtracks out there that make use of symphonic orchestra, the soundtrack in Arcanum is almost exclusively string quartet. This means that the soundtrack doesn't really sound like any other soundtrack out there. When you hear Arcanum music, it doesn't sound like most other video games you've heard. You're gonna sit there and be like, what's that? And then when somebody lets you know it's Arcanum, and you look at the game and you look at its stylings, it just makes sense. The string quartet just makes total sense for this steampunky but also fantasy environment, and it works brilliantly in-game. But it's not just that it works really well in-game because of the theme, it's that it's a really frickin' fantastic soundtrack. You have to keep something in mind. I've had this game since not very long after it came out. I still get psyched up every single time I hear the opening note of the main menu theme. Every single time I go to Shrouded Hills and that town theme starts playing, I instantly get put into a better mood. Same thing goes actually even more for when I go to Stillwater and it starts playing the village theme. Hell, there's a certain point towards the end of the game where the soundtrack is so good that I look forward to it just for that. I'm not going to spoil that location for those of you who haven't gotten there yet, but those of you who have played through the game probably know exactly what I'm talking about already. But regardless of which individual track you're talking about, I'd go so far as to say this is one of the best video game soundtracks ever made. And that ultimately means the real standout of the presentation is the soundtrack. Although that's not to say that there aren't other elements that really do stand out as well, like the pre-rendered cutscenes, which I forgot to mention earlier, which are terrible. They're that late 90s, early 2000s style of 3D animation that just ends up looking terrible. So those are pretty awful, but there are so few of them that it really doesn't matter that much. But what do ultimately matter are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is set in the fictional world of Arcanum, where you have magic and technology colliding. You play as someone who just boards a Zeppelin named the IFS Zephyr, and in mid-flight, the Zephyr is actually shot down by a couple of what are described as strange flying devices, but what anybody from a modern era would recognize as airplanes. You survive the crash more or less unscathed, and when you finally dig your way out of the wreckage, you find that the rest of the passengers and crew weren't so lucky, and there's only one other person still breathing, and that's a guy named Preston Radcliffe, who proceeds to give you a silver ring and tells you to find its owner before he ends up dying. When you finally make your way out of the wreckage, you're spotted by a guy named Virgil, who was the only witness to the crash. He's a follower of the Panari religion, and from what he's seen, he thinks that you are the so-called Living One, which is a reincarnation of the ancient elf Nasreddin, who was a very powerful sorcerer. And thus your quest begins. It starts off fairly simple with trying to track down the owner of the ring, but it very quickly becomes a lot more complicated when you start to get more into the meat of the story and you find out it's really not about the ring at all, but rather events long in the past that are starting to resurface. And once you start uncovering more of the mysteries, things get definitely not only more complicated, but a lot more interesting. And the story ends up being one of the better ones I've seen in a role-playing game. It starts out a bit slow, but the more you explore and the more you experience the actual main storyline, the more everything starts to make sense. Now here's the thing, this being one of the better stories I've seen in a role-playing game thus far, I'd really rather not spoil it for you. But suffice to say, even though it is a bit slow to start, when you really get into the meat of the game, the story is interesting enough to keep you going through the whole thing. But it's actually not just the main story of the game that will keep you interested throughout. It's actually the lore surrounding the world of Arcanum that'll probably really get you interested. Because not only is it well detailed, but it is conveyed to the player in such a way that not only is the lore somewhat front and center, but it's told in an interesting way. It's not just someone giving you an exposition dump most of the time. Most of the time, it's woven into what you're doing anyway, and if you want to ignore it, you certainly can, but most of the time you're probably not going to ignore it because it has direct repercussions on the way the world is around you. For example, one of the main defining features of the world of Arcanum is that magic and technology do coexist, but they actually can't intersect. So for example, if a mage tries to cast a spell on someone with very high technical aptitude, then it might have a reduced effect, or it might not even work at all. By the same token, if someone is a very powerful mage, they have a very high magical aptitude, and that causes technology around them to malfunction. And the entire world of Arcanum is based on that principle. In fact, the main story is partly based on that principle. So if you're a mage and you hop on a train, you might be relegated to the mage's caboose to be as far away from the train engine as possible, and thus not really cause any malfunctions. But if your magical aptitude is too high, then they won't let you on the train at all. Hell, it's one of the primary reasons that the dwarves and the elves don't get along. It's because magic and technological allergies are actually a very real thing in Arcanum, because those two forces are diametrically opposed. Now, of course, that's just one aspect of how the lore permeates the game, but it's not just that. You can point at just about anything in the game, and it's either explained at some point in the lore, or it is left open as a mystery, but it's even a mystery in the game's lore. For example, you can go to the museum in Tarant and you will find that there are various artifacts from the lair of Belerigram, the last living dragon in Arcanum, and one of these is an ancient iron chest that nobody has been able to open. Nobody's really sure where it came from, but one thing is known. It seems to be older than even the dragon itself, and the dragon dates back to the Age of Legends. To give you an idea, that's roughly 2,000 years before the events of the main storyline begin, so you're dealing with ancient history of Arcanum there. And that sort of thing comes up actually rather frequently. You have things like Mazarin's Mystery, a diagram of the various ancient pagan gods that nobody's really been able to decipher. And of course, various threads of ancient prophecies you can look into, or various things like the sudden prevalence of half-ogres when historically those really weren't much of a thing. And all of these aspects of lore are rather naturally introduced to the player by them simply wandering around, exploring, going on quests, and that sort of thing. And because the lore is introduced to the player in such a way, it becomes a pretty natural part of the game just to look into the lore and try to find out more about it, just because it's interesting to look at. Now, does that mean that it's perfectly done? No, there are still certain moments here and there where it'll throw an exposition dump at you, and those can be a bit dull, but most of the time you're actually actively looking into the lore on your own as part of what you're doing anyway, and it keeps things fresh and interesting, even if you're playing through the game again, because then you're going back and knowing what you already know from your previous playthrough, you're expanding upon it. Not to mention that after you finish the game and you see how it actually ends, you probably will want to go back and play through it again to see how things change depending on what you do. That's right, this is a proper role-playing game. Your choices have consequences, and they can even have very lasting consequences for the future of Arcanum. So at its very core, it encourages you to explore. It encourages you to find out more about the game's lore and the history of Arcanum, and why things are the way they are, all of which, if nothing else, helps you to carve your own place in the world of Arcanum. But here's the thing, that's not to say that all of the writing is good, because even though the lore is well conceived and is well implemented in the game, and even though the main story is generally quite good, the dialogue takes a lot of getting used to, because it's done in an almost Victorian style, which means that it has a lot of elevated vocabulary and it tends to be very verbose, so when you're actually looking at the dialogue, there tends to be a rather large block of text. And because of the language used, it doesn't really sound all that natural at first, until you realize that it's a period piece, game set in Arcanum's 1800s, so it makes sense that people would talk like that. It does make the dialogue a bit less accessible to a modern audience, however, so that can be a bit of a detriment sometimes. But apart from having an accessibility issue on occasion, the dialogue is generally quite solid, and it ends up helping the game's atmosphere as well as actually being some just legitimately good dialogue for the most part. But here's the thing, I bring up that term accessibility, which is ultimately going to lead me into the gameplay. So before we get into that, let me go ahead and summarize that the writing is generally one of the strongest elements of the game because of the way it is woven in with what you're actually doing in the game. So that of course brings up the question of what you're actually doing in the game, the gameplay itself. And that's a fairly complicated question because there's an awful lot you're doing in Arcanum. It all starts with character creation, which has you either picking a pre-generated character or creating your own, and when you actually look at the character sheet, it can be a bit overwhelming, because there's a lot of options. And I mean a lot of options. There's a lot of stats in this game, there's a lot of skills, and there are a lot of technological disciplines and magic schools. And things get even more complicated when you decide to put together your own character as opposed to going with one of the pre-generated ones, in which case you will hop into the character creation screen and it will present you with enter your name, choose your race, choose your gender, and choose your background. And there are a lot of backgrounds to choose from, ranging from things like raised by monks all the way to being a bandit, or being a dark elf follower, or being a Frankenstein monster even. And all of these backgrounds give you different advantages and disadvantages. For example, one might make you physically weaker but give you a dramatic boost to your intelligence. Another one might give you enhanced combat skills but make you dumber. Another one might make you more magically inclined but at the cost of an alignment, because alignment is a thing in this game. You're either good or evil or somewhere in the middle, and that actually does affect the way things turn out in the game. This is where having a somewhat confusing interface can be a bit of a problem, but generally speaking, everything has a tooltip, and thus when you hover over a stat or a skill or whatever the case may be, it tells you exactly what you need to know about it. And while it may seem overwhelming at first, once you understand what the system's about, and you should probably read the the manual before actually playing the game to help out with that, you find out that the character creation is one of the strongest elements in the game because it pretty much lets you play whatever kind of character you want to play. You want to play it real safe and just play a melee combatant? Well, the game supports that just fine. You want to play a more risky thing and maybe go with the technology route or go as a mage in order to be a bit more of a glass cannon? That's fine too. Or maybe you want to spit in the face of nature and go, hey, even though I'm playing an elf, that doesn't mean I can't be a technologist, or playing as a dwarf, I can still be a mage. I mean, it'll give you a lot of penalties for it, but you can certainly do it if you want. Hell, if you want to extend the silliness, you can play as a character who has an extremely low intelligence and thus can barely speak. And it's generally quite hilarious, because the game does react to this. But regardless of whatever you choose for your character's initial settings, you really determine the path of progression on your own. Whenever you level up, you're given a point. Except when you get to every 5 levels where you're given 2 points, and you just spend these on whatever you want, whether that be stats or skills or various technological disciplines or the spells. So if you want to play something that is completely utilitarian and adapt it to whatever needs you have in any given moment, that's perfectly fine. Just remember that any changes you make are certainly permanent. Also note that the level cap is 50, which means that you basically have about 64 points to work with in total, and thus you do need to be careful about what you spend your points on. And the world does react to whatever stats and skills you have. So for example, if you decide you want to play someone who is really diplomatic and you invest a lot of points into charisma and persuasion, then most of the time when you run up against a conflict, unless it's something where you're fighting a wild animal or you're fighting someone who just cannot be reasoned with no matter what, you can generally talk the people down, and you can generally twist the conversation to how you want it to turn out. But if words aren't really your thing, and you'd much rather just go in guns blazing, you can certainly do that, or you can run in swinging your sword or axe or whatever it may well be, or using a bow, or throwing things at enemies. Or you can, of course, sling a bunch of spells around to various effects, or use various technological gadgets, or sneak around to get past enemies, and all of that is pretty equally emphasized. And while you should certainly keep in mind that you will be fighting enemies throughout the course of the game, so you do need to at least prepare your combat abilities to be able to handle whatever the game throws at you, generally speaking, pretty much every single thing in the game has multiple solutions, except for in the case of things that do ultimately require a bit of a dungeon crawl. But as long as you maintain a good balance, you should be able to get through the game without too much trouble, although there are certain points where the difficulty ratchets up pretty high, and you do find out that the game is a bit unbalanced. In fact, this balancing issue is one of the biggest issues that Arcanum has, because starting out it may seem overwhelmingly difficult, and then when you get further on into the game, a lot of it seems really easy until you get to certain parts, which ramp up the difficulty extremely high, and you're like, wait, what just happened? But this lack of balancing actually goes both ways, because you can start off the game with a very powerful tech, which is Molotovs, which you can basically construct out of junk in this game, so they are ridiculously easy to make tons of, and as long as you get your throwing skill up decent enough to where you can actually hit the broadside of a barn with them, you end up actually being almost overpowered for a good portion of the game. But here's the thing, even though the game does suffer from balancing issues, they're not so bad that the game becomes unplayable at any point. You do have to keep in mind that it is a party-based role-playing game, which means that you're going to have companions with you throughout the game that are going to be able to help you out in combat, and many of those companions are straight up built for combat. But of course, with the way the party system is set up, you can only have a limited number of companions based on your charisma stat, so you need to be careful about which companions you actually have, although when you find the dog does not actually count towards the limit for the number of followers you have, so that's helpful. And the dog is one of the most useful companions in the game, so you'll probably want to pick him up. It also helps that he doesn't judge you like the other characters do. If you, for example, have Magnus in your party and you start attacking people with good alignment, he's not gonna like that, and eventually he will actually leave your party if you do it too much. But I digress. The point is that there are ways to work around the balancing issues in the game, although that's certainly not ideal. It'd be better if the balancing issues didn't exist. There are other issues in the game that can't really be worked around, however. For example, there are a large number of technical problems in the game, and while it has been patched pretty considerably, and most of the major technical issues are no longer present, you do still notice a few here and there that can get pretty annoying. But that's just it. At this point, they're mostly just annoying rather than game-breaking like some of them were at the game's launch. It's always fun when events don't trigger or you have a save game that gets corrupted or something along those lines. I mean, I had all kinds of technical problems when the game originally launched, to the point where I had to restart the game at least about 10 or so times before I finally got a stable game going. Of course, it is worth noting that that was before any of the patches came out, so once the game got patched, that never really was a problem anymore, and the worst I've had since then is basically a few graphics glitches that never really got all that much more than mildly annoying. But the other major issue that the game has can't really be fixed without a ground-up rewrite, and that is the combat system. This can be switched between two modes, and that can actually be done at the press of a button, which is the spacebar in fact. And those are between real-time and turn-based. Regardless of which one you're using, you only control yourself. You can't control what your companions are doing besides giving them a few basic commands here and there. And those are mostly just target a specific enemy or something along those lines. All of their attacks, their item use, and of course their spell use is determined by AI, so they can often do things that you don't necessarily want them to do. And of course, with the annoying issue of the pathfinding not exactly being the best in this game, which was a fairly common issue of that era, so it's not that surprising, that does tend to happen fairly often, where they'll just start wandering off in a direction you didn't expect them to go in, or they'll take a weird route to get to an enemy that's pretty close to them, and it just ends up being baffling sometimes. But it actually gets worse because the combat system is kind of inherently broken, and that is because of a glitch that never really got fixed. You see, if you play the smart route and you pick the turn-based combat system, then you have a number of action points that are listed in this bar that shows up on the screen, and you can click the end turn button if you want, of course. But that tells you how many actions you have left, and every single time you do something, it takes a number of points. Once you run out of action points for that particular round, or you run out of the ability to really do anything with your action points for that particular round, you can let the turn cycle automatically, or you can click the end turn button if there's nothing else you can do and it hasn't actually started to cycle already, and it will cycle through the turns of all the various combatants until eventually it gets back to you. Meanwhile, if you switch it over to the real-time mode, you end up with pure chaos as everybody acts at once, and there is no such thing as action points. Thus, the real-time mode ends up becoming extremely unmanageable extremely quickly, but you may still be tempted to use it because whenever you're in real-time combat, you don't lose any fatigue for attacking, whereas when you're playing the turn-based mode, you lose fatigue when you attack. To this day, I am still utterly baffled as to why they never fixed that glitch, but they never did, and it ends up making the combat just kind of a mess. There's not really any strong middle ground there. Either you're losing fatigue and the combat is manageable, but since fatigue is so low to begin with, and most things cost quite a bit of fatigue to actually use, you end up running out of fatigue, which means that you fall unconscious, or you switch it over to the real-time mode and you no longer lose fatigue when you're attacking, but the thing becomes so chaotic so quickly that you can't even manage it. Even once you do get used to the eccentricities of the combat system, that still becomes something you never really manage to deal with because it's just a straight-up glitch. And I'm sure by this point, a lot of people are finding that this sounds really unappealing because you have a combat system that's just a mess, you got game balancing problems, you've got numerous technical problems that are still in the game and are certainly annoying, but they're not necessarily game-breaking, and on top of that, you have a fairly high learning curve with a pretty unintuitive interface. But here's the thing, once you get past all of that roughness, what you will find is an absolute gem of a role-playing game. There are very few other games like it, and those games are basically Fallout 1 and 2. There are so few games out there with this much attention to detail in the world, with this much character interactivity with the world, where your choices have consequences, and they have far-reaching consequences depending on how you do different things. And there are really no other games out there that have a universe quite like Arcanum does. I mean, with this balance of magic and technology and the way they intertwine, and again, the attention to detail in how they intertwine. All while giving you so many options for how to play the game that it's actually kind of overwhelming at first. Let me put it this way. As of the time I'm recording this review, I have played through this game from start to finish close to 20 times. And I am still finding new things with each playthrough. Sometimes it's a small piece of lore that I didn't notice before, but then I notice and something else starts to make sense. Sometimes it's an entire quest line that I missed. Sometimes it's just a different way of solving something that I had already solved in a fairly basic way, and then I find out there's so many other ways I can do it. And no matter how frustrating the balancing issues get, or especially the combat system gets, the detail in the world and the amount of player agency is just so incredibly high that it completely drowns out all of the problems that I ultimately have with the game. Does that mean it's a game for everyone? Hell no. There is no way in hell that most average gamers could get past the problems that this game has. It requires a very steady, patient hand, and it requires that you are basically already into RPGs. But here's the thing. Even though I already liked role-playing games when I started playing Arcanum, this was the game that cemented my love of the genre. I'm going to repeat that so that it hopefully sinks in. This is the game that made me love role-playing games. I liked them before. After Arcanum, I can't get enough of them. I ultimately give it a 4.5 out of 5. Again, it is not a game I would recommend to every gamer out there because it's just not very accessible unless you've already got some role-playing games under your belt. But if you have at least some experience in the genre and you're looking to really step it up, Arcanum is your game. If you're a fan of role-playing games, you need to get a copy of Arcanum. To that end, if you somehow don't have a copy of Arcanum already, I'll have links in the video description box to where you can pick them up. Thank you all very much for watching this review and of course tuning in over the past decade. I'll catch you all in later videos.